Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It's Monday, July the 17th, 2023. It's not Monday. Can't be a day about social media, the crisis of social media, books about the crisis of social media, articles about the crisis of social media. There was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times at the weekend about... can you hear me? I think we'll start this again, Tobias. I don't know why oh, here we go. I think we'll start this again. I'm going to run the thing again, okay?
Sure.
Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, July the 17th, 2023. If it's a Monday, it must be a show about the crisis of social media. Books and articles about the crisis of social media come out all the time. There was an interesting piece from a couple of days ago in the New York Times about the crisis of social media by a venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz, really focusing on the impact of Meta's Instagram threads as the challenge to Twitter, all sorts of cage matches apparently between Musk and Zuckerberg. The piece not just talked about the crisis of Twitter, but also about Twitch and Reddit and all sorts of other outrages. But above all else, it's about the impact of threads. The head of Instagram suggested that threads isn't for news and politics. People are too aroused by that, and that's why they're turning away from Twitter. Social media then has become, if you like, the outrage machine, and people are turning against it. That's why they're checking out of Twitter and switching over to threads. My guest today has indeed a new book about social media and the crisis of social media. It's called Outrage Machine: How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. Tobias Rose-Stockwell is a Brooklyn-based analyst. He's done a lot of thinking about this. He's worked with Jonathan Haidt, another leading critic of social media. Tobias, welcome. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
So, Tobias, what do you make of this popularity, or at least what seems to be the popularity of threads? Does it suggest that people are tired of the outrage machine of Twitter?
I think so. I think that, Elon in recent months has shown that Twitter is an unstable place that we don't want to be much of the time. Social media over the last few years has become more and more segmented into ideological groups. And that's very much part of the current design of the platforms, and they tend to push us into more and more ideologically segmented groups. So I think that people have become more just tired of the constant chaos that they were seeing on Twitter. And when we decide to use these tools, we're making conscious decisions sometimes about where we're spending our time. And Twitter increasingly was becoming a pretty toxic place to be. So I think it's understandable that so many people would flock to an alternative.
So coming back to threads, Adam Mosseri, who runs Instagram, suggested that the reason why threads is becoming so popular is because it isn't for news and politics. Is that the fix? Simply do social media and don't talk about politics, in the same way as on Thanksgiving dinners, for example, we tend not to talk about politics because it only annoys people?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a piece of it. social media, I think all social media has this kind of period or this failure mode in which people tend to use it for advancing kind of extreme agendas. And every single tech platform we use, every single social media tool we use, has this kind of opportunity for fringe actors to take control of the narrative and blast out their message much further than it would go otherwise. And so, yeah, if this is a conscious decision by Instagram to reduce the level of toxicity and outrage, it makes a lot of sense. I think that people would want to go elsewhere. It remains to be seen if that ends up being a viable business model, because there is a kind of, while people hate it, they're also attracted to controversy. And and Twitter is a fantastic place to generate controversy and to see what other people are angry about. So if theirs doesn't have that, then I think there's a possibility that people might get a little bit bored with it, unfortunately. But I'm hopeful that it becomes maybe a more kind place for discourse. And
it's interesting that you talk about boredom, Tobias. I do a weekly show with Keith Tier, real Silicon Valley insider. This week, that was the week. We always evaluate the tech news of the week, and he believes that Threads will fail because he says it's boring. So are we bored when there's no outrage, when people aren't screaming at one another?
I think it's a mixed bag. If you look at TikTok generally has a pretty heavy curatorial algorithm in terms of trying to avoid outrageous content. It's not absent from the platform, but it is generally a place where people feel more kind of uplifted and more entertained than outraged. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a market for it for sure. There's a question, whether or not Instagram will maintain a level of kind of distance from the controversy over time if it shows up to be not as viable of a sticky business model. But yeah, I guess that I'm hopeful that people will find themselves in these spaces with more interesting content, more educational content, and less toxic and polarizing content.
Tobias, what's wrong with outrage? There used to be an old bumper sticker in Berkeley where I once lived. If you're not outraged, you're not looking at the world. We're living in a world of increasing inequality, of a looming environmental crisis, of more and more COVID-style pandemics. Why shouldn't we be outraged?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a big portion of my book is really examining the concept and emotion of outrage itself, and when it is valid in society and when it is not valid in society. And I think that there's a lot of scholars and philosophers that will debate when an outrage is worthy of our attention. But when it comes down to it, I think you can kind of split outrages into these different categories, which is things that are based on facts and things that aren't based on facts, or things that are based on.
Yeah, but everyone argues on the facts. I mean, throughout the history of our species, we've never agreed on the facts, and we never will. And people choose their own facts, especially when it comes to politics. That's always the case, and it always will be the case, isn't it?
I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I think that we have systems in place, and we have had systems in place over the last 100 years that have helped us determine what things worthy of our attention are real and what things are maybe not real. And I think that's maybe missing a little bit from the debate about what kinds of things we should be angry about online. I think that in general, social media is a fantastic tool for activism, for building movements, for bringing to light previously unseen harms. But there is this entire category and kind of basket of outrages and things that we get angry about that are actually very much divorced from reality. And reality is knowable. We as much as we'd like to think that it's this kind of like squishy personal truth for everything, capital T truth, or at least degrees of it, do exist, and we can find certain types of information that I think are better than others. And what I mean by better is like they're actually epistemically sounder, right?
Well, I don't know what epistemically sounder means. It seems that the standard progressive narrative is social media is great when it stimulates rebellion against authoritarian governments. It was good in the Arab Spring. It's not so good with January 6th, but I don't really see the difference. People are angry. They don't like the political reality around them, so they go out and demonstrate. Is there a difference in your mind between, quote unquote, the outrage stimulated by the Arab Spring versus the outrage stimulated by January 6th and the 2020 American election?
Yeah, I think there arguably is. Arab Spring was a series of very important political protests that happened as a result of deeply authoritarian states, crushing dissent and doing terrible things to a population for a very long time. I think you take a cross section of a lot of people that participated in January 6th and see that they are actually like deeply misinformed about what was wrong in society. Q is not a authority on the future and on,
it wasn't just people in January 6th weren't just QAnon people, and you could argue with the Arab Spring that the Arab Spring only created a worse situation, the Syrian civil war. A more violent authoritarianism in Egypt, chaos around the region. So I'm not convinced that that the January 6th protest is any more or less outrageous than anything else in history.
I mean, look, we could argue about this. I think that if you blur your eyes and look at them, you're right. They do seem similar, and they do seem to be, both people coming together in a popular revolt against an established system. But I do think they are fundamentally different in terms of the number of people that were beholden and consumers of bad information. And I think that you can make that argument, and I can speak specifically to what I mean by epistemic quality versus not epistemic quality if you're interested. But
yeah, go on briefly, because you use the term. It sounds, I mean, the thing that always occurs to me on this is that people always rely on science when they don't know how to make another argument. They always tell us, well, the research tells us, the science tells us, the epistemological truth. And I have to admit, I'm always a bit skeptical of that, but go on.
No, and I hear you on that. And I think, I go into my book, I go into detail about how, this kind of system of top-down information transfer to the masses has been blown up, completely blown up in the last 10 years, and how we can't necessarily expect it to be restructured or put back together in a way that we all find to be accommodating to our particular narratives. And today we largely rely, instead of on authorities, we rely upon what I call trust proxies, which are individuals in our communities or people that we follow online that act a bit like kind of the smart people in our ideological in-groups that we trust with discerning the facts. So these are influencers. These are people that tend to speak well about a topic, tend to seem like they're knowledgeable about things, but maybe actually quite divorced from the reality of an issue. So I think that kind of, that flipping of the giant epistemic funnel, which was our species used for a long time to kind of figure out what is real and what is not. I think that's a pretty big problem. But to speak to your specific point about, what is knowable and what is not knowable, and I'm not I spent about half the book exploring kind of the history of journalism and how journalism began. How journalism actually was this, newspaper started as this very salacious place where a lot of people made very ridiculous claims about others. They would print fake news regularly. And there was this process that happened over the course of about 80 years that allowed for a better filter to be put in place for our knowledge and information. And that transition happened very slowly, and it happened after a bunch of newspapers said a lot of really terrible things. We had a bunch of moral panics about things. We had political assassinations and people that got extremely riled up about conspiracies. 1800s were not a great time for information, but we got to a better place because there was this competitive relationship that newspapers had with each other, and there was trust and reputation that was attached to various papers year over year. And when people saw that a paper was lying, it was called out by another paper, they would buy a different paper. And so a lot of papers went out of business in the process of pumping out fake news, and a lot of papers were established as reference points for journalistic integrity. And I think we're in one of those transitions now, in a very big way with social media. And I think there's some
I have to again. I'm from the UK originally, where the best-selling newspapers also tell the biggest lies. But let's get to the book. Outrage Machine, really interesting. It's a timely book, Tobias. The subtitle is How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. So it's interesting that the subtitle, and often I know these subtitles are created by publishers, you're not saying social media, you're talking more broadly about tech. And I know you believe, and you argue in the book, that this is a problem not so much with social media specifically, but with the internet more broadly. Perhaps explain that and how you distinguish between tech and social media and the internet and social media.
Yeah, and the term tech is actually even broader than in the book. I go back very far. The book is kind of a secret, sneaky history book, and I go back pretty far in time, back as far as the printing press, to try to unpack how new technologies really disrupt our ability to make sense of the world. The printing press, when it came out, it was a tool that you could argue it was the most violent invention to hit Europe. It caused 100 years of really devastating civil wars and reorganized society in a really tremendous way. But we wouldn't want to take it back. We wouldn't want to say, take the printing press back. Like we like our books. It educated us. It made us much better, smarter humans. It was a great boon to our species. So throughout the book, I focus on different types of media technology and how they disrupt us and push us through these periods that I call a dark valley, where it's very confusing and very outrageous and very hard to figure out what's actually happening. And the results are that we either we make our way through it or we don't. And the times where we don't, there's periods of violence that occur. But eventually, I think we come out the other end. So the internet is the most recent version of that, of this kind of dark valley. And social media specifically, I think, is a very special kind of disruptive technology that we've been reckoning with it for a few years now. We've had about a decade to try to metabolize it, and I think we're starting to see where its failure modes are, and we're starting to see how to fix it. But we're not through it yet. We still have a lot to fix. Understand?
Can you explain, Tobias, how the internet is making us upset, distracted, confused, and above all else, outraged? How is this working?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think, Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator, he had this theory way back in 2007, I believe, that focused on, now that we're exposed to new information, we're exposed to far more information by being online than we would otherwise be. So the fact that we actually just increasing the net quantity of information we're exposed to, it's causing us to find conflicts more often. We're finding ourselves exposed to opinions that we disagree with. We're finding ourselves exposed to ideas that we find problematic. And that's a fundamental difference. It's like when you increase the net quantity of information we consume, you also increase the net quantity of kind of problematic content we're exposed to. But more specifically with social media, there's been some key design decisions that were made between 2009 and 2012. There's 3 small features that were rolled out at social media companies that you'd recognize right away. that fundamentally change the way we observe and consume content on a daily basis. The first is the algorithmic feed. So it's how content is rank ordered and served to us by an algorithm. Rank ordered for engagement specifically, which I think we all know today, right? For a while, people weren't really aware that their content was being rank ordered by a secret algorithm, but it's a pretty powerful tool that gives us good content when we want it. Gives us the stuff that's interesting, sticky, the stuff that sticks to the top of our feeds. But stuff that's outrageous tends to stick to the top of our feeds with a basic sorting algorithm. The kinds of things that that make me angry or that make you angry. If you think about the algorithm's eye view of us, if we're finding it interesting, if people are talking about it, it's gonna try to serve that to us regularly. So the first is the algorithmic feed. The second is social metrics, which is the likes, the visible likes, visible favorites, visible shares, the visible metrics, numbers that are attached to our content. Have inadvertently kind of addicted us to the rewards of posting and getting a response. So the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner built this thing in the 1930s called an operant conditioning chamber, which basically showed that you can put an animal inside a box and flash a light, and if they press a button, they get a food pellet. If the animal is sated and they eat all the food they get, then they're not going to, and then the food comes out regularly, then they're not that interested in continuing to press the button. But if you add a level of randomness to the button response, right? So they press the button and sometimes food comes out, sometimes it doesn't come out. Then it makes us go a little bit nutty. We go a little bit crazy, and we respond to this by pressing the button aggressively, trying to figure out the pattern, which makes sense in the context of our ancestors trying to forage for food. We want to, if there's not berries in this bush, then we go on to the next bush and try to figure it out. So that was a kind of a basic behavioral hack that they figured out, a whole industry that discovered this well before social media.
Tobias, you seem a very reasonable fellow. Don't you ever get angry?
Of course.
You don't
seem all the time. Yeah.
I mean,
I don't right now.
Suggesting that anger is somehow unnatural and that it's created by these stimulants of one kind or another.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think that like I said, anger and outrage is actually very, very critical and important emotion for us, especially in democracies. It's a critical emotion for us to understand what is wrong in society so we can fix it. The problem is if we are exposed to too many outrages and too many narratives of discontent, then I think it causes us to either get extremely angry and get to this point of kind of rigid, rigidly polarized on a particular issue, in which we see enemies and not potential kind of collaborators in solving the problems. We see enemies and people that are actually deeply responsible for the ills of the world in such a way that it's quite dehumanizing. And social media, I think, does that, unfortunately. But democracies require outrage, and we requires people seeing problems in order to fix them. And the problem is we have a threshold, right? If we're overexposed, we either have this response, which is learned helplessness, which is like, oh, I can't do anything about this, I'm going to check out entirely, or we start to completely kind of dehumanize the people that are responsible for it, the people that we perceive.
Tobias, you've presented the internet and social media as one where we're angry because we see the opinions of others that we don't agree with, or opinions that challenge or undermine our worldview. But I've had Eli Parisa on the show several times. Of course, he's the author of The Filter Bubble, a very influential book from, I think, 2011, which suggests that social media and the internet's become an echo chamber where we simply see the opinions of everyone we agree with in our cultural, social groups. Are you suggesting that Parisa is wrong, that the internet really isn't an echo chamber?
I think Eli was very, very prescient about some of these issues, particularly about how we tend to segment into ideological groups. I think when it comes down to the algorithmic sorting of content and how we are basically isolated by our algorithms, that's actually, the evidence shows that's not the case in the way that he laid out in the book, particularly There's some great evidence and research by Chris Bale at Duke that showed that we are actually exposed to, like, when you break our echo chambers, when you break our filter bubbles and you expose people to alternate political opinions, they don't necessarily get less polarized, they actually get more polarized.
Yeah, Chris was actually on the show a few months ago talking about all this. He has a new book out, Breaking the Social Media Prism, which I'm guessing overlaps in some ways with yours. Chris, you also had not Chris, Tobias, you had an interesting piece in LitHub, where this show also comes out this week, on reconstructing our attention in the era of infinite digital rabbit holes. Of course, this issue of attention, you're not the first person to address this. My old friend Nick Carr's been on the show many times. He wrote perhaps the most influential book on attention. How is social media undermining our attention? What do you mean by rabbit holes?
I mean, this feels like a pretty well-trodden path, but yeah, I mean, attention is
well-trodden hole, not path.
Yeah, or yeah, exactly, sure, right.
Well burrowed,
a well-burrowed hole by many great writers and thinkers in the last few years. But yeah, I mean, attention is zero sum, right? We only have a finite quantity of attention in our days when we wake up, and it is what dictates everything about our lives. And these tools have become very good at extracting attention from us. So good, I think, that you could argue that they've been winning this battle for our attention over the course of the last 10 years. It basically essentially makes choice a squishy topic when we are exposed to so many triggering points of stimulus throughout our days. We've actually habituated ourselves to these tools as well, right? Like, even if you're not being served something on social media on your phone, a lot of research shows that we self-distract because we've been trained so effectively to check our devices and to try to get that that connection point to the machine. And yeah, that's I think that's scary, because attention is such a core part of agency, of choice making. And if we
haven't we had these fears before? Every new media, Jeff Jarvis is an old friend of mine. He's been on the show. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He has a new book out now on Gutenberg. I'm going to get him on the show. I mean, he reminds us that every new media creates this cultural paranoia. Television, radio, reading. Socrates and Plato argued about it in the Republic, about the value of writing stuff down versus oral presentation. Is this new in any way?
I think it is. I think it is, insofar as the differences in degree create differences in kind, and I think that we are in a different kind of attentional capture era. But that being said, part of the process of pushback and part of the process of having a moment of collective moral panic about something, whether it's a real panic or a moral panic, is I think important in developing cultural antibodies to kind of fight off a potential invader, right? A potential piece of technology that is overextending us, that is causing problems. But I mean, coming back to your initial question about mis and disinformation, it's really important for us to be clear about what these tools are doing and what they're not doing, because it's very hard to actually figure out what the effects are in a moment of kind of media chaos like this, right? It's actually really hard to determine what is actually happening. So, which is why we need to rely upon researchers to study this stuff and go, as deep as possible into the evidence of harms.
What about the generational element here? We've done lots of shows on it. We did one with the Financial Times' Hannah Murphy, for example, about whether, in her mind, teens are paying with their sanity for social media. Is there a generational quality? Is everyone being impacted in this outrage machine in the same way, or is it having a particularly destructive impact on the minds of young people?
Yeah, I mean, per evidence, I defer here to Jonathan Haidt, my collaborator at NYU, who's done, I think, a really fantastic job of laying out the evidence that particularly young people, young teenage girls, are susceptible to some of the worst harms of social media, and that is pretty concerning. You know, teen anxiety and suicide rates are anxiety, depression, and suicide rates are up pretty dramatically in recent years. And I think the evidence per John's work in aggregating a huge quantity of evidence around this and trying to really thread through you know, the mounting evidence for and against, he has found pretty strong correlations with social media use and negative mental health outcomes for teens.
Yeah, you've worked with Jonathan Haidt, and you co-wrote a very interesting and influential piece in The Atlantic from 2019 on the dark psychology of social networks, its impact on democracy. So the subtitle of the book, to go back to it, Tobias, is "What are we going to do about it?" So let's spend the rest of this conversation talking about fixes. You've written some interesting pieces. You had a big think piece on 4 essential questions to, quote unquote, in your language at least, break the outrage machine. Just as Mark Zuckerberg wanted to move fast and break things, you want to move fast and break Mark Zuckerberg, perhaps.
Yeah, I've little ill will towards.
You're not going to do a cage match with him?
No, not anytime soon. Yeah, I generally think that people at these companies are well intentioned, but
even Musk. I mean, Musk seems particularly unpleasant and juvenile, doesn't he?
Yeah, but I think that Musk, you know, for what it's worth, has also been beholden to the dynamics of social media in a way that has actually kind of broken his brain more than most people, right?
He's a casualty, perhaps. Yeah,
yeah, I know, agreed.
He's
100%.
the medium and the message. So let's talk concretely, because I know the book really does. It's one of the strengths of the book. How are we gonna break the outrage machine? How are we gonna maybe not so much break or reform it? What needs to change?
Yeah. So I put solutions into kind of 3 big buckets. There's things that we can do as individuals. There's things that platforms can do, and there's things that governments can do. You know, as individuals, there's a bunch of, I think, simple heuristics that we can use, like simple kind of questions that we can ask to help us navigate our own usage on these tools. You know, one of the emotions that I think is very important to pay attention to when we're trying to figure out how much time to spend on these tools, how much we should be outraged, how much emotional investment we should make into them is the emotion of regret. And regret is a really key emotion. It is what's called like a system 2 emotion, right? So in Danny Kahneman's work, system 1 versus system 2 thinking, fast thinking versus slow thinking, regret tends to actually be a really powerful indicator of when we've done something retrospectively wrong. And when we wake up after spending 4 hours doom scrolling or in a YouTube hole, and we feel this like pang of like deep regret about how we spent our time, using that moment to really do a hard shift and reset on your tools. And there's plenty of amazing tools out there right now to help reduce usage. So putting as many frictions in place as possible for you as an individual between the rabbit holes. I have a whole kind of body of different tools that I use to stay focused, to stay on track, and to avoid getting sucked into these digital rabbit holes when I am in a low agency state. And I think it's really important to recognize that.
But you have to, people have to recognize there's a problem to address it. I mean, most people don't even seem to acknowledge that it's a problem. Most people don't blame social media, so to speak, on their anger. They see the anger as reflecting a reality. What about for those people?
Yeah, I mean, look, you can't force people to change their behavior unless they're ready to change it. For those people, I would focus more on the other 2 intervention areas, which is what platforms can do and what governments can do.
Okay, well, let's talk about the platforms. You wrote an interesting piece on changing Facebook's design. You believe that that these companies like Facebook are selling our fear and outrage for profit. We've done lots of shows on that in the past, the sort of surveillance capitalism narrative. Do you think that platforms like Facebook, I mean, maybe they're doing it even with threads, can they address this? Are they willing to?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, there's whole trust and safety departments that have been built around trying to make these tools less toxic. And there's I think it's important to not necessarily think that there's a single silver bullet. A lot of this stuff has to do with small design decisions, or I guess big design decisions that have small impacts on large groups of people on these platforms. The rank ordering of content and how content is served to us is a really deeply influential decision. The weights and measures that go into the algorithms that serve us outraged content versus not outraged content, that is versus like useful content versus interesting content. That is a critical that's a very important piece of the puzzle here, right? These are basically the most powerful kind of editors and chiefs of our generation.
Right? Let's take the environment as an example. We've done many shows. Many people are not just angry; they're profoundly disturbed by the imminence of our environmental crisis. This week, we've had record temperatures all around the world. How would a social media platform like Facebook, how would it address that when it comes to the climate? Would you want people, so to speak, would you want Facebook to calm people down on the imminence when they go outside and it's 120 degrees? Shouldn't they be angry, and shouldn't they recognize that? And what can social media or the internet do more broadly to address real problems?
Right. So I think the key there is really is the word real, right? One of the problems with social media is that it fragments our attention so dramatically, and we can't agree upon what is a existential risk versus what is a small distraction, or even a false risk, right? Something that is actually fake, right? A moral panic, if you will. And so we need to have weights and measures put into these tools that help us understand what is real and what is not real. And I think that's kind of a big statement. Right.
Isn't it what newspapers, jumping in here, I apologize if I'm, because we need to move along. It's a really interesting subject, Tobias. I mean, isn't that what newspapers do? When you look at the headlines of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're quite different because their politics and their editorial profiles are different. I mean, that's just reality, isn't it?
Of course, yeah. But however different they are not putting fake news on the front page, right? And I want to be clear that the difference between the kind of curatorial decisions of these various newspapers, they still have a very fundamental structure of verification, of corroboration that's built into the design of the type of news that we read on these.
So how would this impact on, say, MSN or Fox, which seem to me to be one way or the other evangelical platforms in which individuals preach a conspiratorial version of the world to an adoring audience?
So, yeah,
I mean, and that's television. That's not even the internet.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not. Tell me. How would I fix MSNBC? Was that your question?
Well, but I mean, that's pre-internet, and it seems to have proliferated or metastasized on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, MSNBC and Fox, I think, are great examples of industries that have, or major media players that have built their entire audience around trying to stoke outrages where they can, not entirely, but largely, right? It's mostly analysis and opinion, which I want to be clear. Like, there is actually a real fundamental difference between those analysis and opinion pundits and straight news. Like, straight news is an actual enterprise. It's the enterprise of journalism, and it is different than editorial writing and editorial analysis and punditry. So I think that most people don't recognize that journalists there's a whole kind of institution steeped in knowledge and the culture of verification that is a big part of the core of journalism. So the book is both kind of a critique of journalism as well as like a defense of it, and the pieces of it that are most important for kind of taking into the digital world of social media. But yeah, people need to understand that opinion is not the same thing as straight news.
Tobias, what do you make of so-called Web3 decentralized social media platforms like Mastodon and I can't remember the name. Is it Blue Angel or something that
Blue
Jack
Sky.
Dorsey is Blue Sky that Jack Dorsey has founded? Do these offer fixes, or is it just getting deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole when you have more and more decentralization?
Yeah, I think that I tend to think that a lot of the harms from social media are actually addressed properly when they're centralized to some degree. So I do think it's really important to have accountability with these companies, and that's a really big piece of what's wrong with the internet right now with CDA 230, the Section 230 legislation that was passed in the 90s that helped create the internet. It was great legislation for helping to create the internet, but it reduces liability for the companies that are actually producing great harm right now. And
so you must have been disappointed with the recent decision of the Supreme Court to essentially accept the legal legitimacy of Section 230.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I think that case particularly didn't have a great chance of making it through. I think that there are better cases to be made for reforming Section 230 that really do that involve harms in a more kind of a more strategic and surgical way that aren't necessarily blanket statements about liability.
So let's you talked about this third bucket, government. Last week I was at the Braver Angels convention, and appropriate enough in Gettysburg, site of the great battle of the Civil War. Utah's governor Spencer Cox was speaking there, talked about sacrifice and selflessness. I'm not sure if you've been reading your book, Tobias, but certainly from groups like Braver Angels and perhaps from No Labels, there's calls for more cultural or political tolerance. Is that one way we can address your outrage machine, or does it need to come more from government regulation on stuff like Section 230?
Yeah, I mean, governments have limited things that they can do, I think, to really, fix these problems. But I do, and Braver Angels is a fantastic organization. I think they're doing, really, really important work in trying to bridge some of these divides that have been cleft between the political parties in this country. And there's a number of these organizations that they're really trying hard to figure out what kind of cultural messaging works very, very well for kind of piercing these ideological walls. But yeah, governments themselves, unfortunately, do have kind of a limited basket of solutions that they can pull from. But I think reforming Section 230 to increase the liability for these companies is actually a huge piece of the puzzle here. More specifically with TikTok, I think that there's, TikTok has a whole set of other potential harms to, I think, our country and our sense of unity and our ability to effectively, deploy democracy that I think need to be addressed also. But the key thing is that social media is not, it is not as different from media as we think, right? It is, if you blur your eyes and look at it, it's actually very much like the decisions that are made to algorithmically serve us certain types of content versus other types of content are very much media type decisions, right? So people aren't using they're using TikTok instead of watching TV, right? They're using TikTok instead of watching the news. They're using social media oftentimes instead of watching the news, instead of getting their information from a place that is actually more liable for the types of stuff that they get. So
I actually have the fix, Tobias. I just think, can we make Keenon the required platform? Everyone has to watch and listen, and then we don't have any of this anymore. We'll just have Tobias telling us what is true and what isn't. In all seriousness, Tobias, finally we seem to be coming to the end of the social or conventional Web 2.0 social media age and entering the AI age. What do you make of AI, and does it have the potential, I'm guessing you will say both, to either amplify, compound the rabbit hole, the discontent, the disruption, the outrage, the anger, or could it be the fix?
Look, that's a huge, huge question with AI. I think AI does pose
Your next subject of your next book, Tobias.
Perhaps. I think it does pose potentially a real existential risk. I know you've spoken about it on this podcast in the past, but yeah, I mean, the quantity of I think about this in terms of what AI could do right now, and not kind of the more fantastical stuff it could do in 10 or 15 years, which is probably quite fantastical. But right this second, the potential for flooding our minds and our society and our discourse with garbage is very very large. So I think that if you think about the pipes, the way that we actually get, we get our information, that is largely through social media these days. Even if you're reading the news on the New York Times or wherever else, there is this, the feeder mechanism is social media for a lot of our information these days. So I am mostly concerned with how AI affects our kind of consumption of mis and disinformation, because it's becoming a zero cost endeavor to produce deepfakes and to really make extremely confusing content. And this is a portion of the book is dedicated to democracies and how democracies function, and how democracies actually flip towards authoritarian states if things become too noisy and confusing. And that actually does happen. It's happening in a bunch of different places around the world right now. When there's too many competing narratives, when things are too murky, people tend to go with their guts, and they tend to defer and default to strongmen and people that tell them what they want to hear. And that is really the biggest danger, I think, in the near term from AI.